Okay, we're going live. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the session on secure computation. The session moderators are Elet Boyle, Nishant Chandran, Eyal Kushilevitz, and Alessandra Scafuro. And let the session Welcome to the session on secure computation. Yeah.
All right, so let's start. Welcome everybody. Before we start everything, I want to remind you that if you have any question, you can use the Q&A box, and please make sure to remember the name of the speaker to which the question is directed to, so that we know who to ask. So our first speaker is Carmita Zai from Berlin University, and she's going to talk about the price of active security in cryptographic protocols. So Carmita.
Okay, is that good?
Yes.
Can you see the slides? Okay, good. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the price of active security in cryptographic protocols, and this is a joint work with Mutu and Morvas. So secure multi-party computation is a tool that allows the parties to directly communicate while obtaining the same security guarantees as in a setting where they have the parties have access to a trusted party. So security is modeled in the presence of an adversary that corrupts any subset of the parties, and while not learning anything beyond the output of the computation. And basically, we prove security in the presence of two types of, most of the time, two types of corruption models, where in the passive setting, the adversary is a benign adversary that follows the protocol strategy while trying to violate the privacy of the honest parties. And this is a very weak adversary, while in the active setting, the adversary may follow an arbitrary strategy. And this is a more realistic attack model. Another aspect of security is how many parties would the adversary corrupt. In the honest majority setting, it may corrupt up to half of, less than half of the parties, while in the dishonest majority, it may corrupt all but one. Working in the combination of achieving active security in dishonest majority is considered pretty much one of the most challenging setting. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on this model. Let me just say that working in the dishonest majority setting have the advantage that the party does not need to trust anyone but itself. Okay, so a common paradigm in secure computation is designing a protocol that first achieves passive security and then amplify its security to the active setting. And this talk will be about the overhead of active over passive. Well, specifically, we'll be interested in measuring the communication complexity of the price we need to pay compiling passive to active. More concretely, the theoretical question, or maybe a theoretical goal that we're asking is, can we compile passive to active at essentially no cost, meaning that the asymptotic complexity of the active protocol will be essentially the same as in the passive protocol? And this, you can actually extract a concrete question where can you concretely measure the overhead from passive to active, and can we make it as small as 2, even less than that? And to abstract the theoretical, maybe to approach the problem, we consider or we abstract our solution using a building block that achieves a secure multiplication. So we describe our solution in a hybrid model where we have access to a secure multiplication functionality, and we measure the complexity of our solution as the number of time access to this functionality. And we basically decouple the overhead of the cryptographic task from the information theoretic task using this functionality. So this is basically functionality well known in secure computation. Basically, the parties, so it takes shares of some two values, A and B, over some secret sharing algorithm. It could be additive sharing, could be Shamir sharing, and it produces the shares of the product of these values after reconstructing these values. And given this abstraction, I can concretely maybe describe the question we are sort of solving or working on in this paper. And we would like to measure the overhead of achieving active security over passive, given only black box access to this multiplication functionality over an arbitrary field size, and in different settings. So it could be even in the honest majority setting. So state of the art with respect to this question. So in the two-party setting, we know how to achieve constant communication overhead. Remember, we want to measure the number of calls to this function. So the overhead, the measurement is communication complexity. In the two-party setting, we already have solutions for these problems, at least asymptotically. In the arithmetic setting, due to a recent work with Yuval Muto and Antonio Mercedon, we know how to decrease this constant to 2 over large enough fields. In the multi-party setting for Boolean, the Boolean case, the overhead over passive YAO is S over log C, where S is some statistical parameter. The overhead over GMW is polylog in the statistical parameter in the size of the circuit. For the arithmetic setting, current techniques know how to achieve constant overhead over passive for the GMW protocol in the OLE hybrid. So given this state of the art, this is what we achieve in this work. We show a compiler that compiles passive to active using constant number of calls to this fmult functionality, where the implementation of this fmult should only be passive. So the constant number of calls to passive fmult per multiplication gate. So this is our main result. And in practice, it could be brought down, this constant, even to 2 for large enough fields. And I just want to wrap up by just saying a few words about the technical part of this compiler, by saying that if you're familiar with the IPS compiler, where it has 2 building blocks of an inner and outer protocol, we basically, in this work, you can frame it as taking the dual approach to IPS. So in IPS, instead of they're using a specific inner protocol and different instantiations for an outer protocol, we do the opposite, where we have a concrete instantiation of an outer protocol and different instantiation of the inner protocol using fmult. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karmit. We can maybe move to the next speaker. Next speaker is Georgios Panagiotakos, and his talk is on resource-restricted cryptography, revising MPC bounds in the proof-of-work era. Georgios?
Thank you, Alessandra. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see this?
So we can only see half of it.
Half of it.
I can see quarters, so you're lucky.
Okay, perfect. Now we can see the entire
Great.
slide.
Okay, so this This is joint work with Juan Garay, Gilos Hayas, Raf Ostrovsky, and Vasilis Zikas. So secure multi-party computation has been studied since the 80s in what we call the traditional MPC setting, where the number of parties is fixed and their identities are known. They share synchronous secure channels. The adversary is either probabilistic polynomial time or computationally unbounded, and parties may share some setups, such as the PKI. Now, setup functionalities can be further categorized into two categories: public state setup and private state setup. Public state setup says the following: I'll sample a string from some distribution, and then everyone will learn this string. You can think of a common random string as a kind of this setup. And private setup says the same, but now different parties learn different parts of the string, and you can think of this of an example. The PKI, where not everyone learns the secret keys of parties. Obviously, public state setup is a weaker assumption than a private state setup. And this has been nicely highlighted in the MPC literature. So assuming a private state setup and honest majority, we can do MPC. While on the other hand, assuming a public state setup and that a third of the parties can be corrupted, first, broadcast is impossible due to a paper from Portland in 1996. And then, because MPC implies broadcast, MPC is also impossible. And we can further strengthen this result by additionally assuming private channels, enhanced wrapper permutations, and a random oracle. And what I've said up to now is nothing new, but it becomes really interesting if we consider what happened the last 10 years in what we call the proof of work era, where proof-of-work-based blockchain protocols were introduced, such as Bitcoin, that typically implement a functionality called a transaction ledger, which is related to broadcast, and have been shown to be secure, assuming that the majority of the parties is honest, as long as all parties have the same amount of computational power and access to a fresh CRS, which is a form of a public setup. Now, to make things more confusing, these results have been showing what is called the permissionless setting, which is a bit different than the traditional MPC setting I mentioned before. And similar results have been shown by restricting other resources that parties may have, such as space. So the question we try to answer here is whether this MPC impossibility result I mentioned still applies in the traditional MPC setting under the resource restricting paradigm. Okay, so what we do first is take a more abstract view of resources and model restricted resources as restricted network access. So we introduce a functionality wrapper that wraps network functionalities and has the following properties. First, probabilistic access, that is, new messages are sent with some probability P. Second, bounded access, that is, at most Q messages are sent per round. And third, free forwarding. If I receive a message or if I send a message once, I can forward it for free. And we saw that that if we wrap an authenticated network with this wrapper, we can implement it by assuming bounded access random oracle in the CRS setup. Then we revisit the broadcast impossibility result I mentioned and show that there exist protocols such that the broadcast impossibility attack is not feasible, even if the adversary can corrupt a third of the parties, as long as the parties have access to this filtered network functionality. The basic idea there is that the adversary cannot stipulate multiple honest parties due to the limited amount of resources it has. And then after explaining why the broadcast impossibility doesn't work, we deal with MPC feasibility in this setting, where we have honest majority and public setup. And first show that assuming if parties have access to a filtered network functionality and signatures, they can implement a registration functionality. And then taking advantage of UC and older works, we saw that we can implement actually the MPC functionality even against adaptive adversaries. Further, it's obvious how to go then to a result which says that we can implement MPC starting from a bounded access random oracle and a CRS setup. Concluding, I would like to say that with this work, we show that resource-restricted cryptography once more challenges long-established MPC impossibility results, and that's why it deserves further research. And we identify a couple of interesting directions. First, implementing the filtering functionality by restricting other resources besides computational power, which is what we do here. And secondly, revisiting other lower bounds and seeing whether this still hold in the resource-restricted setting. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgios. Do we have any quick question for this talk? Okay, so we had some questions for Kermit, but we are going to answer them at the end of all the talks. So let's move on to the next speaker. Next speaker is Siddhartha Jayanti, and this talk is on efficient constructions for almost everywhere secure computation. Siddhartha.
Hello, everyone. Could you please let me know if you can see the slides?
We can see the slides.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Siddhartha, and this is joint work with Srini Raghuraman and Nikhil Vyas, who are friends of mine and also PhD students at MIT. So the talk is on efficient constructions for almost everywhere secure computation. So in this work, we're interested in creating secure computational networks, which we'll denote as graphs G equals VE. The nodes in these graphs represent distinct processes and the edges represent secure links. So the goal is, given a number of nodes n, to design a graph for them and a protocol pi that tells us how to communicate from any node u to another node v. And the difficulty is that we're going to be faced with failures. And so we'll denote by T the set of failed nodes, and failures are Byzantine, meaning that the failed processes can coordinate and deviate arbitrarily from the protocol pi. So there's a famous result in this field. And traditionally, the secure communication is studied when nodes are connected as a complete graph. And in that case, if the number of failed nodes T is less than 1/3 of the total number of processes, then all non-failed nodes can communicate with each other. However, if we want to have a complete graph over nodes, then we would need like 500 billion links even for just a million processes. So in this work, we're interested in sparse networks, G. So if you have a sparse network where the degree has to be low and some of the nodes fail, then some other nodes can become disconnected from the rest of the graph. As you can see, the orange node is disconnected from the rest of the graph, and thereby it's doomed, even though it has not failed. We call a clique of nodes that can communicate with each other. They don't need to be a clique in the graph, but a set of nodes that can communicate with each other pairwise, privileged. And we want to make a large subset. So we use the terminology T for failed nodes, and we want that to be as high as possible. We want to be able to sustain many failures. We want the number of doomed nodes to be very low. And we also want a protocol with good work complexity. And we call the pair of how many nodes we can allow to fail while still allowing many, we call FFN, GFT, where T and N are the failed nodes and the doomed nodes, to be the resilience of the network. So this problem has a nice history. It was initially construed by Dwork et al., and they gave a protocol with a constant degree graph that sustains n over log n, O of n over log n failures, and allows at most O of T nodes to be doomed. And it has a linear work complexity. So that's where things started off. And then Upfel observed that if you use an expander graph, you can get a constant degree graph and sustain up to linearly many failures. However, his work complexity was very high. It was exponential in the case of many failures. And so Chandran et al. Tried to mitigate this. And they came up with a protocol where the degree is no longer constant. It went up to polylog, but it has the other nice properties of the Upfel work. And it also has linear work complexity. In this work, we use the ideas of Dwork and Upfel to improve on the Chandran result. So we get a log n degree graph that has the same resilience as Chandran et al.'s network, and we bring down the total work to polylog n. So I won't have time, of course, to go into the details of the result, but I'll just quickly tell you the sequence of events that gets there. So we have 3 results that build up to our main result. In the first result, we showed that if failures are not adversarial, but they're random, then there's a constant degree graph that's highly resilient with a linear work complexity. From there, we showed that in fact, for this graph, if you do something clever, you can bring down the work complexity to polylog n. We use the probabilistic method there. And then from there, we take this graph and we multiply it log n times and show that that graph is resistant to even adversarial failures. So that's the result. The main open question, of course, is can this O of log n degree be brought down to constant, and that would make everything optimal? Or is there a fundamental barrier to this? Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Siddhartha. Do we have any quick question before we move on? All right, good. So let's move on to the next speaker. Next speaker is going to be Andrew Morgan, and his talk is going to be on succinct, non-interactive, secure computation. Andrew?
All right, let me get the screen sharing set up. Is that working?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you for the introduction. And today I'll be talking about recent work done jointly with Raphael and Antigone, which constructs a protocol for succinct, non-interactive, secure computation. Non-interactive secure computation, or NISC, refers to two-party secure computation with minimal round complexity. That is, 2 rounds where only one party, the receiver, gets the output from the protocol. We'll also focus on security against fully malicious adversaries. Furthermore, we'd like to minimize interactivity in terms of communication complexity. If we think about a private outsourcing of computation type setting where a weak receiver or the client wants to outsource a complex computation to a powerful sender, the server, then it would be great if we could optimize both the communication complexity and the receiver's running time of a NISC protocol to be independent or nearly independent from the functionality being computed. Formally, we'll call a NISC succinct if both these complexities are polynomial only in the functionality's input and output length and polylogarithmic in its running time. So this notion, as well as the private outsourcing approach I just mentioned, were actually some of the primary motivations behind fully homomorphic encryption. One of FHE's earliest applications was a semi-honestly secure succinct NISC, where the receiver encrypts and sends their input, and the sender homomorphically evaluates the function f. This doesn't give malicious security since the sender could perform the wrong evaluation. Proving correctness while preserving succinctness, if we want to do it directly, would require a ZK snark, which isn't currently known in the plain model or from standard assumptions. On the other hand, if we do want malicious security, there are many known protocols which give malicious security in models with trusted setup, as well as a recent protocol by Badrunarayanan et al., which is based in standard assumptions and gives malicious security in the plain model, albeit relaxing to super polynomial time simulation or SPS security, since 2-round NISC with polynomial time simulation is well known to be impossible in the plain model. All the maliciously secure protocols in literature, however, have communication complexity which is polynomial in the running time of the functionality, so they don't achieve succinctness. This brings us to the main question of our work, which is, can we have a NISC protocol satisfying both malicious security and succinctness? Since so far we know of protocols which have one property or the other, but not both at once. Our work answers this question in the affirmative by constructing the first protocol to achieve both properties, giving both succinctness and either SPS security in the plain model or polytime simulation with a CRS. So our main theorem constructs a protocol which gives both malicious security and succinctness given a non-succinct maliciously SPS secured NISC, FHE, and a scheme for adaptive delegation of computation, which essentially provides a way to efficiently outsource and soundly verify computation on publicly known inputs. Also, all of our primitives can be based on quasi-poly hardness of learning with errors, meaning that our protocol itself can as well. Furthermore, in the CRS model, we can instantiate non-succinct NISC with polytime simulation based on polytime hardness of LWE, and we can use that to likewise get a succinct NISC with polytime simulation in the CRS model, which is also based on polytime hardness of LWE. So to briefly explain our construction, we start with Gentry's FHE-based approach, like I've already described, and rather than a ZK snark, we'll use the relatively lightweight delegation protocol to have the sender prove that it indeed performed the right homomorphic evaluation. This is succinct since delegation features a proof length and verifier running time polylog in its functionalities running time. However, delegation requires the inputs of the computation to be public to both parties, which is problematic since for malicious security, we need both parties' inputs to be both private and generated independently from one another, or in a technical sense, extractable. So we'll instead perform the verification in the functionality of our non-succinct NISC and have parties provide their inputs to the inner protocol rather than revealing them to one another. Also, since delegation does have efficient verification, we can do this without violating the succinctness property of our complete protocol. Aside from the sender, we'll also need to make sure that the receiver generated its first round message correctly. And we can once again use the inner non-succinct NISC to succinctly do this by adding the public keys and ciphertext sent by the receiver as inputs and verifying them with respect to the randomness used. This step, interestingly, relies on perfectly correct FHE and delegation protocols to avoid the possibility of a malicious receiver using somehow adversarial randomness to generate a first message that would verify, but would also break the correctness of the protocol. There are also plenty of additional steps in the proof, as well as some interesting technical subtleties that I'm omitting in the interest of time, which I'll discuss in slightly more detail in the full version of the talk. And of course, we provide a complete discussion with the formal proof in our paper. So to quickly summarize, we construct the first NISC protocol in either the plain or CRS model, which satisfies both succinctness, where the communication complexity and receiver's running time are nearly independent of the functionality, and also fully malicious security with either SPS in the plain model or polytime simulation with a CRS. It's constructed from FHE, delegation, and an inner non-succinct NISC combined in a fairly intuitive and technically interesting way. And all of these primitives and thus our protocol are implied by learning with errors. For more details, the full version of our talk is on the website and our paper can be found either there or on ePrint. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. We don't have any quick questions for now, so let's move on to the next speaker. Next talk is on PSI from Paxos, fast malicious private set intersection, and our speaker is Mike Roswig. And yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Could you even see it when I go full screen? That's the question.
Let's see.
Yeah, how's this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So this is joint work. Oh, wow, it advances automatically. This is joint work with my collaborators, Benny Pincus, Nii Trieu, and Avishai Yanai. So private set intersection is a special case of MPC. Each of the parties has a set of items, and they want to learn which of the items they have in common, but they don't want to leak items that are not in this intersection. So that's the basic scenario for private set intersection. Here's kind of the state of the art. So for semi-honest protocols, the leading protocol is this KKRT protocol, which I'll briefly discuss a little bit. That's Kumaresan, Kolesnikov, Rosolek, and Trieu. Takes about 4 seconds for a PSI of 1 million items per party. There's a sizable gap in performance between the semi-honest protocols and the malicious protocols. You see the fastest and lowest communication malicious protocol is due to Rindel and Rosolek. What we do in this work is we almost close the gap in performance from semi-honest PSI to malicious PSI. So we introduce a new approach for malicious PSI. It's only 25% slower than the current best known semi-honest PSI protocol. And I feel like our main idea is simple enough that I can convey it to you in 5 minutes. We'll see if I succeed. So I'll tell you a little bit about this KKRT protocol. It's the semi-honest one that's the fastest known because our technique builds on this. So in this KKRT protocol, both of the parties agree on 2 hash functions to map their items into bins. And Alice is going to place each of her items into one of those 2 possible locations. That's basically cuckoo hashing. And on the other hand, Bob is going to place each of his items into both of the 2 possible locations because he can't really anticipate which bin Alice is going to place each item in. And then for each bin, they're going to run an oblivious PRF, which just means that Alice learns the output of a random function on one input of her choice, and Bob learns an entire random function, a different function for each bin. And then Bob can send a bunch of these PRF outputs, one for each item, well, actually two for each item, because each item is in 2 bins. And then Alice can look at what she recognizes, and from that she can conclude what's in the intersection. So this is the state of the art for semi-honest PSI. And it doesn't achieve malicious security because of the following kind of attack. So Bob is supposed to send 2 items, 2 of these PRF outputs per item. And if he just sends 1, then it sort of breaks the protocol in a strange way. So let's imagine that Bob withholds one of these things that he's supposed to send. Alice has this item C. Remember, she has 2 places that she can put the item. If she puts it in one of the places, then she will recognize one of Bob's PRF outputs, and she'll conclude that it's in the intersection. But if she places it in the other position, then she'll conclude that it's not part of the intersection. And this is not really a devastating attack, but it sort of breaks the simulation. We can't simulate this in the ideal world because it's sort of dependent on all of Alice's other items. So our main challenge is to overcome this problem. And the way we do it is, I can state it in one sentence. Instead of placing the item in either of the 2 possible positions, we're going to ask Alice to secret share her item into the 2 positions. Okay, so Alice generates this vector which satisfies all these linear constraints, that secret sharing values into 2 positions, and then they proceed just as they did before. And as long as we have a PRF that satisfies this homomorphic property that I've written in the bottom left, then everything goes smoothly. It turns out that it's possible to actually the oblivious PRF that you would imagine using automatically satisfies this property for free. So we kind of get that as a bonus. And now Bob just has 1 thing that he needs to send per item. He doesn't have this situation where he can send half of the information. It turns out that it's possible to simulate Bob's behavior here. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip this, although I'll say that it's not quite what I showed you. What I showed you was that Alice secret shares an item into 2 positions in this vector. That doesn't quite work. We need to allow Alice to secret share the item into several positions in the vector, and that's what we call this probe and XOR of strings data structure. Any data structure with this property plugs right into the protocol that I showed you. We give a new construction that has a constant rate, so the size of this vector is linearly related to the number of items, and that's what leads our protocol to have low communication. So just to summarize, we close this gap between malicious and semi-honest, and we have this new cute data structure that we call Paxos. And if you want more details, check out the full version of the talk or the full version of the paper. But thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mike. We actually have a quick question for you from Christian Kashen. The question is, does this have applications to contact tracing?
One of my co-authors, I hope is in the audience, but she has a recent paper that she's worked on in her postdoc about applying PSI for contact tracing. I don't know all the details, but yeah, I think, I don't claim to be an epidemiologist, but at least superficially, the idea of contact tracing is just an intersection of, the intersection of the various people that we've come in contact with. So I think there's probably a space for PSI in some aspects of contact tracing, although none of the proposals that I've seen, like this DPT3, the more popular ones that I've seen adopted by Google and Apple, I don't think they use PSI. They managed to get by with something much simpler. But I think in principle, there could be a place for PSI in contact tracing, yes.
All right, thank you, Mike. Let's move on to the next speaker of the session, which is Ran Cohen. And he's going to talk about broadcast optimal two-round MPC. Ran.
Okay, thanks. Can everybody see?
Yes.
The slides? Excellent. Okay, so this is joint work with Juan Garay and Vasilis Zikas. And we're going to look at secure computation, a general secure computation protocol where a set of parties want to compute a function on their inputs. They want to protocol to achieve certain properties like correctness and privacy. But we know that unless we assume an honest majority, we cannot get the properties like fairness and guaranteed output delivery. In this talk, we'll focus about corruption of all but one of the parties. And that means that we consider the weaker security notion of security with a board. That means the protocol satisfies privacy and correctness, but the adversary has the ability to first learn the output from the computation and then cause the protocol to abort, forcing the honest parties to complete the execution without learning their outputs. In fact, security with a board comes in many flavors in the literature. The strongest version of the definition is security with identifiable abort. That means that if the adversary cheats and causes the honest parties to abort, they will identify one of the cheaters. One of the corrupted parties will be identified by all honest parties. A weaker notion is security with unanimous abort. Here, it is no longer guaranteed that the honest parties will catch a cheater, but it's guaranteed that either all honest parties get the output or all honest parties know that there was an attack and abort. So the abort is unanimous. An even weaker relaxation of the definition is security with selective abort or non-unanimous abort. And here it is no longer guaranteed that all honest parties will identify the attack. Each party on its own will either obtain the correct output from the computation or will abort, but the honest parties do not have the ability to know whether the execution went well for everybody or not. A main question in the study of secure computation is how many rounds do we need to compute a function? Clearly, one round isn't enough because the corrupted parties can simply wait for messages from honest parties and then evaluate the protocol over different inputs of their choices, which will violate privacy. But in the last decade, there were a series of work that showed that in a broadcast model where every party can broadcast a message, can post it on a bulletin board for everybody to see, then two such broadcast rounds suffice to compute any function. The first solution in that line of work required heavy assumption like full homomorphic encryption or indistinguishability obfuscation. But two works in Eurocrypt 18 by Garga and Srinivasan and by Ben Hamuda and Lin show that we can actually compute any function using two broadcast rounds if using the optimal assumption of two-round oblivious transfer. This assumption is optimal because if we have the ability to compute any function in two rounds, then obviously we can also compute oblivious transfer. But so we're optimal in the sense of a cryptographic assumption, but a broadcast channel is a strong assumption on the communication level. And the question that we ask is whether we are also optimal in that sense. Or stated differently, do we really need the ability to broadcast in order to compute any function in two rounds? Normally, broadcast isn't available as a physical resource, and we use protocols over point-to-point channels to realize it, where every party can talk to other parties, but not necessarily to broadcast message. So realizing broadcast over point-to-point normally costs in terms of round. It will blow up the round complexity. And in this work, we study the trade-off between the usage of broadcast and the achievable security guarantee from the computation. Our upper bounds, all of them hold assuming the optimal assumption of two-round oblivious transfer, and our lower bound hold given any correlated randomness as a setup for the parties. The first result is given two broadcast channel. We show that the original protocols that only stated that they achieve unanimous abort can be easily pushed to get identifiable abort. They can get the strongest notion of security with abort, where parties can catch cheaters. Next, we show that if the protocol doesn't use broadcast in both rounds, identifiable abort cannot be achieved in general. So first we show that if the first round is over point-to-point, we can still get unanimous abort if the second round is over broadcast, but we cannot get identifiability. If the first round is over broadcast, but the second is over point-to-point, we show that we can no longer get unanimous abort. But we can still compute every function with selective abort, security with selective abort. But in this situation, the first broadcast round is not really needed. And in fact, we can compute any function with security with selective abort, where parties communicate only over point-to-point channel without using any broadcast assumption. So that summarizes the results of the paper. I won't go to any details in this short version of the talk, but you can see the online paper or the full version of the talk. And I'll conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ran. Do we have any quick question for Ran before we move on? Okay, so let's see. Yes. Is there, this question is from Tom Roder. Is there a version of abort that is both selective and identifiable?
One can think that way, but that means that each honest party locally identifies somebody as cheater, but they do not jointly identify one specific party. One can come up with that secure definition. It will be, I guess that would make sense more if parties can convince other later on that the party they identified is really cheating. Otherwise, corrupted parties can blame honest parties. So yeah, I guess it is possible to come up with such a definition, but to understand the application that will be used for, I guess depends on the situation. That's a good point.
Okay, so maybe another quick question from Antigone. The result on the table, there are for any two-round MPC?
Yes, the lower bounds holds for any two-round MPC. We show functionalities that no two-round protocol can realize them in those communication models with the required security guarantee. For the upper bounds, we give specific protocols that require only oblivious transfer.
Okay, thank you. We'll take the other questions later. Let's move on to our last speaker. He's yes, it's Daniel Masny, and he's going to talk about two-round oblivious transfer from CDH or LPN. And yes, we can see your presentation. Daniel, whenever you are ready. Oh, I think we cannot hear you. Okay, you are.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So thanks for the introduction. I hope you're all doing well. My short presentation is about two-round oblivious transfer from CDH or LPN. And this is a joint work with Nico Dudling, Sanjam Garg, Mohamed Hajiabadi, and Daniel Wicks. For Daniel Wicks, I forgot to add his affiliation entity research in the original slides. So I want to emphasize it here. So these slides are actually the slides of my full presentation. So don't be surprised if I skip a couple of slides. I included all of the slides in order to answer your questions. So let me give you like a short overview. So we construct this two-round oblivious transfer. Oblivious transfer is a protocol between the sender and the receiver. I guess most of you are familiar with it. And the sender has basically two inputs and the receiver wants to learn one of them. And for oblivious transfer, there are various different security notions. A very common one and very powerful one is simulation-based security. And in simulation-based security, we want to have that for any adversary A that interacts with a sender, there exists also an adversary A prime that interacts with an ideal primitive. And this security notion is very powerful, but at the same time is also very challenging to construct a scheme that suffices the security notion because it requires the adversary A prime to extract the input from the adversary A. If we consider simulation security for the receiver, there is also simulation-based security, but there's also a weaker notion, which is indistinguishability-based security. And that's much more handy and much easier to construct because here we don't need to extract the input of the malicious party. We just say that the malicious party cannot distinguish between the interaction with the honest party for, or here in that case, with the honest receiver for input 0 and the honest receiver for input 1. So what we do in our result is we first show that indistinguishability security for the receiver together with simulation-based security for the sender is actually sufficient to construct an OT that is simulation-based security for both parties. So if you want to construct simulation-based secure OT, it's sufficient to consider simulation-based security for the sender and indistinguishability-based security for the receiver. Now, how do we do that? We first use this notion of OT tilde to construct two-round zero-knowledge proofs. And two-round zero-knowledge proofs together with this notion of OT tilde is sufficient to construct simulation-based secure OT. But now the question is, how can we accomplish the simulation-based security for the sender? And here we introduce a sequence of security notions for the sender that are weaker than simulation-based security. And we construct that CDH or LPN imply a very, very weak notion. And then we show a sequence of generic transformations to lift this very weak notion up to simulation-based security for the sender and indistinguishability-based security for the receiver. So let me give you a summary. So how do we get this notion of OT tilde from, for example, of computational Diffie-Hellman? We first introduce a notion called elementary OT, and we show that this is implied by the CDH or LPN assumption. And then we introduce a couple of other security notions, including search OT and indistinguishability OT. And we give generic transformations between elementary OT to search OT and then to indistinguishable OT. And this indistinguishable OT is sufficient to construct this notion of OT tilde. The very weak notion, or the weakest notion that we introduce, is this elementary OT. And it's really the weakest notion that you could consider for oblivious transfer because it simply asks that the adversary cannot learn both of the input strings of the sender. And if oblivious transfer that doesn't suffice, the security definition should be always considered broken because this is a very powerful attacker and therefore it's a very weak notion. So I won't go into the technical details of how to construct it and how these transformations look like. I refer you for that to the full talk or to the paper. But the take-home message of this talk is really that we simplify, in some sense, this constructing simulation-based secure OT by introducing a couple of weaker security notions and show generic transformations. And we show that this very simple notion of elementary OT is actually sufficient for getting simulation-based secure OT. So if you are interested in showing a feasibility result that an assumption implies simulation-based secure OT, it's sufficient to consider this very simple notion of elementary OT. And in our case, we show that from a CDH or LPN, but the main effort in our work is really showing these generic transformations. So therefore, our work is much more generic than the title of the paper might suggest. Yeah, thank you for attending the session and your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Daniel. And thanks to all the speakers in this section. So we had a lot of questions, and the authors did a great job in answering online. But what I would like to do, I would like to give a chance to all the speakers who want to maybe expand on their answer. The speakers who didn't have a chance to talk during their talk. So maybe starting from Kermit, would you like to expand on your answer online, or you are happy with the chat?
I just say maybe a sentence on each. So the first question by Nigel asked about going from passive to active. So I just wanted to say that our compiler works for also for the honest majority setting. You could just plug in the right instantiation of fmult and you get the same result over small feeds also for honest majority, which wasn't achieved before. So. Okay, that's it.
Great. Siddhartha,
I think it could be useful to read out some, because there was interesting questions that the audience can't see here. So maybe we can just, if you want to go for the speakers, or we can read out, for example, Benny's question, comment.
Do you want me to read the question, or?
The question was, can we hope to get a more general conversion theorem from any semi-honest protocol to the malicious setting, even in the case where the protocol does not handle the circuit of the function in a gate-by-gate manner?
Right, that's a very good question. I mean, the hope is yes, but not using our abstraction, because our abstraction is sort of the gate-by-gate. We abstract the multiplication operation, and we count the number of operations per gate. So, so that won't work in a different paradigm. So I would assume we could do that, but not using our techniques.
There's a question to Siddhartha. How does your protocol deal with adaptive corruptions?
So our protocol works against worst case corruptions, and there's nothing in it that would prevent it from working against having adaptive corruptions is equivalent to just those guys always being corrupt and acting honest until that point for our protocol. I guess there was also this question about the constructivity of our protocol. Mm-hmm. And so our protocol is not, so we don't give a deterministic construction. We give a randomized construction, but our randomized construction works with all but exponentially small probability. So it should probably be just fine. That's the answer. We also think you can probably de-randomize it if you try. We just didn't try all that hard.
A question for Andrew. Could you comment on the server's complexity in your solution?
Right, so I answered briefly in text, and I can expand a little bit more in my answer now. So the server's computation is necessarily at least as expensive as computing the functionality of the delegation, which in this case is the homomorphic eval of the function f. But since I answered that, I was at least able to confirm that we can instantiate the primitives in such a way that the remainder of the server's computation is essentially succinct. So it's not much more expensive than just computing the homomorphic eval.
Question from Mike. Can you comment on the intuition behind this new data structure?
Yeah, I gave an answer in the chat. I can elaborate here with some visuals, maybe, some backup slides. I promise I won't take very long. What I described, probing 2 positions per item, it almost works. It fails to work when there's a cycle, like the one I've highlighted here. So the way we get around that is we just add some extra positions in this vector. And for each item, we probe a random subset of those auxiliary positions. And because it's a random subset, then with high probability, all these linear constraints are linearly independent and they can be solved. And then the question is how you do this efficiently. But there's more details in the long version of the talk, but that's the main idea.
Question for Ron. For your lower bound results, do you assume a bound amount of correlated randomness? Do you also allow an exponential size correlated randomness?
So our lower bounds are based on the cheating parties don't send messages over point-to-point rounds in a way that the honest parties cannot use this information to either identify who was cheating in the identifiable abort case, or simply cannot complete the computation in the unanimous abort case. So yes, the low bounds hold for any correlated randomness, including exponential sized one.
Another question for Ran. Could one replace the broadcast functionality in any round by some weaker functionality that is still accessible by all parties?
So in our upper bounds, we do need every party to be able to broadcast in the broadcast round. I don't see how we can push it to weaker communications requirements. It would be, I would be happy to think about weaker assumptions than broadcast, but I don't see how to use it at the top of my head.
Questions for Daniel. First of all, clarification, what does the OR mean in your title? Do you reduce your scheme to only one of the two assumptions, CDH/LPN?
Yes, so we can construct this very weak notion elementary OT from CDH, but we can also construct it from LPN.
How efficient is the CDH-based construction?
So it's not very efficient. Our main target is really feasibility. So in each of these generic transformations, we require that, or we need to repeat the previous OT multiple times, usually security parameter amount of times. So you get something like, if lambda is your security parameter, lambda to the 4 or lambda to the 5. So that creates a huge overhead.
Another question, do you have to use LPN? Can it be expanded from binary to mod Q?
So I guess that's targeting whether we can construct it from LWE, and yes, we can, but we only considered LPN because there are lots of previous works that already construct two-round oblivious transfer from LWE. So therefore, we only advertise it as from LPN. But maybe there are some parameter settings for LWE where it hasn't been known previously, but we didn't explicitly state that in the paper.
Maybe the intention is to ask about an extension of LPN with low humming weight noise to bigger fields.
Okay, we haven't looked into that. I guess that should be possible. Usually it's more advantageous to consider like modulus 2 because it's also more efficient. But yeah, that doesn't really answer the question. Yeah, we haven't looked into it, but I guess it should be possible.
So there's also an incriminating question that has just popped up with a video of cryptographers, which will be censored for now. Final clarification question to Daniel. Does your generic transformation hold in the UC setting?
Yes, it does.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure how to share the YouTube link, so we'll figure this out.
Maybe you want to sing it live.
No, that's okay.
There are no more questions, so then we have to see the video, right?
So.
Yeah. Maybe Tal, you can give her singing permission in addition to speaking permission. So Okay. Maybe Tal, you can just post it on the chat as well. This is another channel of advertisement.
So this is the conclusion of the questions.
I guess if there is time, I will ask one more question to Daniel. I didn't catch all the details of the transformation, but it's so the zero. You need this two-round zero knowledge to go from, in some sense, from passive to active. And this zero knowledge is you need to use this transformation is purely non-black box, right?
Yes. Yeah, basically OT implies this two-round zero knowledge that we need, in the sense that we could use a Sigma protocol with some special properties, right? And usually that has just a binary challenge. And then OT directly gives you like a reduction for the round complexity of such a protocol, because in some sense you allow the malicious party to only learn one of the two responses, but not both of them if you use OT. That makes sense.
Yeah. So we have time for more questions.
Okay, I have a question for Siddhartha. So there was also this model where you could consider corrupting edges as opposed to corrupting parties. And there the results were far worse in terms of the degree of the graph that one could construct. Did you guys think about if your techniques might apply in that context to improving the results there?
So we did actually think about that model for a bit of time. I don't remember latent thoughts about it, but I don't think we got very far in terms of doing anything. Yeah. So not too many great insights, but I think that's an interesting other question to look into.
All right. So if there are no more questions, clarifications that anybody wants to say before we end the session?